Hello and welcome back. For those of you joining us for your first session today, it's great to have you here. And it's also great to have those of you who attended Scott Wing's session back here with us again to take a different view of the effects of climate change on people. In just a moment, I'll be introducing Bill Fitzhugh, and we're delighted to have him with us. He's the Curator of Archaeology and the Director of the Arctic Studies Center at the National Museum of Natural History. I know you're going to enjoy interacting with Bill, and there are going to be many opportunities for you to do that and with each other during the session. So listen carefully, put yourself in the mood and for some interaction. Remember, you can type questions in using the question box on the left, or you can also Twitter them into us using the words @poll_chat. And then just put your message in. All right, so feel free to send that our way, and we'll be looking for your interaction. All right, so with that, please join me in welcoming Bill Fitzhugh. Bill, it's good to have you with us.
Hi, Jonathan. Yeah, it's great to be here. I like to look at the world in a little different way than a lot of people do. I want to start off with this globe picture here. This is a picture that up until a few years ago was pretty unknown to most people, and of course now with all the science that's coming in about the Arctic and the changes in the Arctic, it's becoming a lot more common to see a polar view. But 20, 30 years ago, when I began my archaeological work in the north, we didn't really think about the world this way. We thought about it as a Mercator projection with north at the top and a huge expanse up there with nothing in it. Of course, with satellites and kind of science we have today, we now can look down on the northern world, and we've discovered a lot of things about it geographically that are surprising and are very different from everything else we know about the history of other regions in the world. The great Eurasian landmass, of course, has a history of its own, and migrations and peoples have moved around there, but we have always thought of North America and South America as kind of like an isolated area that people didn't get to until 15 or 20,000 years ago, and this is still the case. So the Americas are kind of a test case for cultural development, and once they're peopled, of course, once people get down into the lower part of the country, they're isolated from the rest of the world that they came from. The Bering Strait is a kind of a barrier. It's just kind of difficult to get through because of the climates and so forth. And the Atlantic Ocean has been a huge barrier too. So contrary to that sort of isolated history that we have in the Americas for the last 15,000 years, where cultures went their own way, the Arctic zone around the world has had much more a unified culture history because it's close to each other. You can migrate along the shores, you can cross over the ice in wintertime, and just like the animals that are common to the whole polar basin, we've discovered that a lot of the cultures that live there are also common to that region. We'll be talking about that now for the next 50 minutes or so, and I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we came from in the early times and how the climate system works in the north. Some of it you've heard from Scott and other people's Bert's presentations. Then I'll talk a little bit about what's actually happened in the history of the Arctic zone, giving you some examples from the ice ages up to modern times, and then a little bit at the end about what we can learn from the Arctic history of peoples that may be relevant to the future, just as Scott has discussed with us. So I think we can move along, and of course the Arctic has been a place that's been lodged in our imaginations for ever since the discovery years in the 1700s and 1800s, 1900s, when explorers went into the north and discovered strange new lands that they weren't familiar with. They were thought of as exotic places. They were kind of surprised to discover that people actually lived there. But the amazing thing is that the Arctic is a very rich place to live if you know how to live there and how to get along. That's what we need to be thinking about, in terms of the future here on Earth. We have to think about how we can change our lives to adapt to situations that confront us. The first European who ever traveled into the Canadian part of the Arctic and the New World Arctic was Martin Frobisher, who did that in the 1570s, launched 3 expeditions searching for gold, searching for a route to the Northwest Passage to China. This is a picture that John White drew of some of the interactions that he had with some of the Inuit people. This is one of the first illustrations of Inuit from the Canadian Arctic ever to be seen in Europe. The problem with Frobisher's project was that he was, one thing was he was looking for gold where there was none, and this is a picture of one of the gold mines that he thought he had discovered and brought tons and tons of this rock, black rock, back to England, and some of it you can see in British cathedrals and stone walls today. It had no gold in it whatsoever, and it may have been a scam to raise the money for the expedition, something that scientists know well about today. But the problem that ultimate problem he faced was that he was not adapted to the Arctic environment the way the Inuit have been for thousands of years. And he also was traveling in a time when it was the worst possible time to be going into the North American Arctic. It was the beginning of the Little Ice Age, and the ice was much thicker than it had been, and we'll see how that affected the Vikings later on. If he'd been 500 years earlier, around 1000 AD in the medieval optimum, or today, he wouldn't have had the big problems that he did. So at this point, I'd like to just mention that the reason the Arctic is important and why we see such dramatic changes north is because of this very interesting phenomena of the freezing and thawing of ice. When the temperature drops a little below 32 degrees, all of a sudden water turns to ice. It turns to water. And when you think of the Arctic Basin and all of the lands surrounding it, the lakes and the rivers and the oceans, this creates an amazing change in the world that you saw in that first picture. It creates an ice surface of ice for people to live in, for animals to live in underwater, travel on it much easier than they do in water, and so forth. So over the ages, that little temperature switch between below or above 32 degrees or 0 Celsius has transformed the world hugely. When we think of ice ages and the movement of glaciers back and forth, we have to think of just this simple little temperature drop and the tremendous differences it creates for animals and adaptations, people, everything. So that's an sort of an important point to remember. We are seeing now major changes in the Arctic, seeing the Arctic ice disappearing much faster than we ever thought. This little picture of walruses on an ice pan is kind of symbolic of what's happening. The walruses need to have ice to rest on and to sun on in between their bouts digging clams on the bottom of the Bering Sea in North Atlantic. And as you can see, the the ice is getting a little tight. It's getting a little tight for those walrus there, and they can't survive without those kind of surfaces. They can't exploit their environment fully without an ice platform. A couple of years ago, in 2007, I was a trip leader on a Smithsonian Journeys project to the Arctic Ocean, and we were charged with a bunch of scientists and a bunch of tourists, clients on this trip. We're all looking into the effects of climate change in the Arctic Ocean. This is a picture of us zodiacking around the north side of Wrangel Island. Wrangel Island is northwest of Bering Strait. It's about 100 miles out into the Arctic Ocean. And as you can see, pretty balmy conditions and not a lot of ice. This was our home base, the Kapitan Khlebnikov, the Russian icebreaker that hosted us. And as you can see, looking north, no ice in sight at all. This was the big major minimal ice year that we've experienced in 2007, and it really woke people up about the amount of change that's happening in the Arctic areas today. One of the big problems we're all facing is what's going to happen with the polar bear, and I think I'll return to that, but this animal is not adapted to open water conditions, as you have no doubt heard. There's a lot of problems associated with how he will survive and whether he will survive in the numbers that we're accustomed to, probably not. Also brings up questions: if polar bears go to land, how are they going to interact with grizzlies and brown bears? And they're already in Siberia eating reindeer from the Chukchi reindeer herds. And so there's a lot of faunal changes that we're going to see that take place, get these kinds of changes. This is a herd of reindeer that we encountered with their Chukchi reindeer herders on the coast of Siberia. And these guys are real concerned about the polar bears coming ashore. They're also very concerned about what happens to the animals during winter. If you start getting warmer winters and icing of feeding grounds, that can have a devastating effect on caribou and other kinds of land animals. Okay, well, this is how we go about our work. Archaeology is a great way to look at the past. We get samples of tools, of animals and food that people were eating. We find out what kind of houses they lived in, and so on. So this is a kind of one of our tools. Scott was talking about measuring leaves from the rocks. We have to dig for our materials, and frequently we dig in the permafrost and conditions where cultural materials are available if we're lucky and we find the right spots. So archaeology is a major tool for working on this stuff. Just take a break for a sip of water here. Okay, now I want to just have a little primer here on the physics of what's going on. One of the reasons we're so surprised by what's happening in the north is because of the discovery of feedback mechanisms that are changing the environment much faster than we expected. And as you see, the left side of the slide here, I guess I have to click for my little arrow. It's up here. There we are. Okay, so here we have on this side, this is the Earth in the summertime, and you see when ice melts earlier in the spring, it opens up ground. The ground is darker than the snow, and so it absorbs sunlight. The sea ice melts. When this sea ice melts down here, it creates darker water surfaces that absorb more solar energy, so less is reflected back into the atmosphere. Over here on this side is the kind of winter regime, and we see the reflectance of the solar energy off the white snow and off the fast ice down in here. And when that melts earlier in the spring, that opens up these darker surfaces and so forth. So we get a huge change in the environment. And it's only 5 years that we've recognized that those feedbacks were much stronger than anyone had imagined. It's not something that is limited to the Arctic. It's happening all over the world where you have temperate zones that have ice in the middle, ice in the wintertime. So what happens when you have warmer summers? Basically, the forest line that you see here around the globe, this is the Eurasian side, that forest line marches north, and at various times it's been way up here in northern Taimyr, it's been higher in the Canadian Arctic up into the shores of Coronation Gulf. When it's colder, the tree line retreats largely by burning of the northern tree line, and it moves south like this. So in addition to the vegetation changes and the changes in the subsistence zones, the forest zone versus, say, the tundra, you have major changes in the oceans. So when you have more Arctic ice coming around down Greenland and being exported down the Labrador Current, you have an expansion of the Arctic marine habitat, which includes whales and seals and walrus and fish and so forth. When you have warming period, those currents diminish, and the Arctic conditions are, the Arctic animals, sea mammals, are found forth. And that's important in what we're going to see happen here in a bit, dealing with the cultures occupied this zone. Caribou, as I've mentioned, are a really important resource for people on the land in the northern regions. They're the source of your winter clothes. They're the source of sinews for sewing your clothes, for food. Winter furs and the antlers are what you make a lot of your tools out of. So anything that affects the caribou affects people in a major way, and it also affects the northern Indian peoples or forest-related peoples, as well as the Eskimo peoples who also use caribou in the Okay, now just a little bit of the climate history. This is 100,000 years. Over here on the left is the early end, 100,000 years ago, and over here is the Holocene. And you can see that all through this 100,000 years, there is these tremendous variations, and they're very rapid, some of them, coming and going back and forth from conditions that are much colder today to conditions that are, more or less like they are today. This is modern conditions up here. Then you had a big spike at the very end. It got very warm, and then within a couple hundred years dropped precipitously. This is called the Younger Dryas period, and then after that it rose very rapidly to the modern era, to the Holocene. I wouldn't say it's too modern. It started 10,000 years ago. But you can see a number of things here. You can see how rapid and how frequent these changes have been. So the kind of steady state that we see today in the last 10,000 years, we think of climate change affecting us, one way or the other, and you see that those changes are pretty minimal compared to the changes we've had during the ice ages. But very rapid changes, and we have, animals and plants and people have had to deal with this as they have through history. And the big changes, of course, were this is the circumpolar region. Here's the North Pole. Here's North America, Greenland, and Eurasia. And you can see the development of these big ice sheets during the ice ages. And one of the really interesting features of this is that, we had huge ice sheets all over North America, from the west coast to the east coast, including Greenland and the high Arctic. But the Bering Land Bridge, which was then land, this dark part between Alaska and Siberia, was ice-free, and all of Siberia was ice-free until you got way over towards the western part of Siberia and then onto Finland, Norway. So, in the ice ages, North American area was totally covered with ice, but there was only a local kind of ice sheet over the western part of Eurasia, leaving all of Eastern Asia, all that part of Eastern Asia that's very high and very cold, completely ice-free. So in an interglacial, it takes a long time for ice sheets like this to melt, and Scandinavia. But as soon as the temperature changes, all this Eurasian, Siberian, Arctic area became warm very fast. And so it kind of acted as a big reservoir for animals and people and cultures. And as you see, some of those moved into the world. So this is, again, your graph. This is the end of the Ice Age here, and then it gets warmer. And we're going to look at a few periods in this. Look at this period here, just when it's warming up. Paleo-Indian period coming into America, and we're going to look at some things that are happening at various stages during the last 8,000 years. By the way, this slide is coming from an exhibit that we did called Arctic, A Friend Acting Strangely. This was a Natural History Museum exhibit that we put on in 2007 that was kind of at the front end of the public concern about what was happening with climate and weather. And unfortunately, the exhibit is now available only online, but at least it is available. And you can learn a lot from looking at that.
And you can find a quick link to that from the virtual exhibit hall from the National Museum of Natural History section.
Yeah. Well, so this is just a little snapshot of Europe over here during the ice ages. This is during one of the cold snaps in the ice age. And we had this Younger Dryas period. I mentioned to you that very cold snap. And that's named for this plant, this Dryas, a very distinctive plant that is a good signature of the Arctic zone, the a tundra plant. And you can see that the Dryas plant had moved all the way down into Spain, along the north coast of the Mediterranean, south of the Black Sea, and so forth. So normally, this is the boundary of that plant. It's way up here in Scandinavia and northern Russia. So you can see it's a huge change, and it forced people to move way south. This is the Neanderthal period, 100,000 years ago. That would have been the beginning of the Neanderthal period down to 13,000 when this event took place, and that's well into the Homo sapiens period. So humans have had to adapt to huge changes in the environment, and we could even look at human evolution in sense as an evolution to Arctic and near-Arctic conditions, because for great periods of the last 100,000 years, the boundary of it was tundra in Europe, and so people have been adapted to cold conditions for a long time. This is another, this is the famous conveyor belt chart that shows you how those kinds of conditions get exported around the world through the currents that circle the globe and then come back up north. And one of the drivers for this current regime, which is what maintains our modern climate regime, is taking place up in the North Atlantic, where where cold water sinks into the deep ocean and drives this. It's kind of like an engine. As it sinks, it pushes water along, and it pushes it down on this cold blue line, and then eventually it circles around, warms up, and comes back up here, cools off again, and comes back down. So today, one of the big questions and one of the fears is that if major changes begin happening to the carbon cycle and current regimes, that we may force ourselves into an ice age, or alternatively into a very bad warming period, partly because of these ocean currents. So that's just another we need to worry about. So in the ice ages, I'll have a few of these scenarios that I put in here, and you can think about these later on, but I just sort of suggested, imagine yourself being the leader of a Neanderthal family living in Germany 40,000 years ago. That's during the Ice Age period. So after a series of warm winters and dwindling game, which way would you counsel a tribe to move to improve their survival chances? Well, just think about how that Arctic boundary moves. These guys are mammoth hunters. You know, the mammoths aren't going to hang around in Europe when tundra leaves. They're going to head north. So, you know, in this case, you know, the answer to this question is let's go north. Let's follow the animals, and that's what probably people have done a lot during history. They've learned to live according to certain adaptations to certain animals, or marine mammals or land mammals, and as those animals changed in climate change, people had to change too. So we're very much talking about a kind of a human history that parallels the history that Scott was just talking about in terms of plants, and also with animals too. So we're part of the natural world in that sense, and we can't really can't depart too far from that without causing a lot of big trouble.
And by the way, just take note of how Bill walked us through that scenario. We're going to have a few others, as Bill mentioned, and we'd like you to try your hand at thinking through a few of these as well.
This is the Holocene period. This slide is kind of backwards. This is the cold end of the Ice Age. Here's the warming. The cold Ice Age here, and the modern period. But this is just to show you that during the last 8 to 10,000 years, we also have had many of these cycles. So it got colder, it got warmer 8 to 10,000 years ago. Then we had a stable period, and then it dropped down for a while. This is called the Little Ice Age, around 1500 AD, and this is the medieval warm period when the Vikings sailed the Atlantic, and we'll talk about some of those things as we go along. That's just a reference for you. I want to mention this site after the end of the Ice Ages. There was people migrated north to an amazing little island up here north of the New Siberian Islands. Today it's about 300 miles north of the coast of Russia. Here's Bering Strait. This was the tan was the land, and the little line here was the current shoreline. So you can see that the sea levels were about the way they are today, but not quite the same. But the big change was here. There was dry land all the way out to Zhukov Island. This is a Russian colleague of mine who's been working out there, and this is an 8,000-year-old site. Caribou hunters and polar bear hunters that was occupied on that island until the sea levels rose up enough so that they had to run for cover.
We did have a question on the last chart. I thought maybe we could just go back for one moment. The question is, what are the numbers on the side depicting here?
These are temperature ranges here. This is, I'm not exactly sure what these have to be. Yeah, you got me here. I'm not sure about why these. This one may be Celsius and one may be Fahrenheit or something. These are averages. These come from ice cores and others. I'm sorry, I really can't answer that question right now. But as you can see, the difference between these the peak here, where we are today, and where we were down in the ice ages is usually thought to be 5 to 6 degrees centigrade difference. So here's a close-up of that Zhukov site. You can see the incredible amounts of wood that was collected by these people. This is driftwood coming out of Arctic rivers. It's just full of wood, and it's all broken up because of the permafrost. So they were living in some kind of wood houses way up here on the north edge, near the edge of the Arctic Ocean, 8,000 years ago, which was one of the warmest times we've ever seen in the last 10,000 years. Here's a shot from Wrangel Island. This is when we were on that trip up there, and you can see caribou are getting out to Wrangel Island, walking across the ice and getting out here. This is a shed caribou antler. But you can see the kind of environment it is today. It's a tundra environment. And one of the amazing things that was discovered on Wrangel Island about 10 years ago was that it had been occupied by mammoths, and that there's a long history of mammoth occupation of Wrangel. When the sea levels were lower, the mammoths were out there. They expected to find, 12,000-year-old and 20,000-year-old mammoths at the end of the Ice Age, guys like this. This isn't the woolly variety. It should have a woolly picture here because they definitely were woolly. But they also found bones dating as late as 5,000 years ago. And these were like dwarfed mammoths. They had lived on Wrangel Island for well into the Holocene, longer than any other mammoths on Earth. And they survived until about 5,000 years ago. And in fact, they became very small. As you can see, this is a classic situation of dwarfism because of isolation on the island after the sea levels rose. So the habitat deteriorated and the animals got smaller. And then about that very same time, the first humans showed up on Wrangel Island. This is known archaeologically, and they occur at just exactly this time. And so it raises the question of what was going on out there. And I have another little scenario for you to think about. If you were an archaeologist at that island and you found a piece of engraved mammoth bone, a figurine or something like that, you tried then to figure out, well, were they hunting the mammoths or were they collecting the ivory from dead mammoths that they found lying around? And so this is just one of the types of interpretations you have. Frequently, archaeologists don't have an easy way to make an interpretation that they're sure of. So, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. At the moment, we're really unsure about whether people killed off the last mammoths on Earth on Wrangel Island, or whether the mammoths went extinct and then people showed up. But you can play with that idea of how archaeologists make interpretations. One of the most amazing things that happened at this time, this is about 12,000 years ago, was the immigration, 12 to 15 or maybe even 20. It's being discussed a lot in archaeology now. When people moved into the New World, my colleague here at the Smithsonian, Dennis Stanford, has kind of turned things on their head. The traditional story is that people came in from Siberia, crossed Bering Strait when it was a land platform, and then spread down either along the coast or through an ice-free corridor into the lower 48 and into South America. When they came, they arrived. They find these Clovis points, which you see various varieties of Clovis-type points. And that marks that culture, and they spread all over the place. Dennis has been exploring the idea that maybe there was another migration. Maybe the main Clovis migration might have come from Europe along the edge of the ice in the North Atlantic. It's a controversial story, and he's got a lot of interesting data and is publishing it now. So we'll be hearing a lot more about this. But we do know that most people who entered North America came from Bering Strait, and that they kept migrating into the New World long after the initial migration. And we also know that the Indians, as well as the early Eskimo peoples, also came in those directions. And when there was ice and the sea levels were lower, it was very easy to walk across that area. There was game and so forth. Another of the interesting ideas is that there seems to be more evidence now for a maritime entry route and not just an overland route. So those are some things that we're clued in by the changes and the disappearance of ice from northeastern and some parts of northwestern part of North America, and climate warming dramatically. And it seems like a real coincidence that the first people show up in North America just about at that time. So still have some discussions about, how did they get here? Did they kill off the big game in North America? They certainly did, at least in some areas. Was climate the big issue, or was the incentive? Did they happen to have reached a stage of cultural development where they could migrate across northern land bridges and into the New World? Had they developed boats that allowed them to go along the coast and so forth? So all the time, archaeologists are faced with this problem of looking into alternate explanations.
And we're getting some people sharing some good thinking here with us. A number of people are asking about whether their DNA evidence could be used to prove or disprove a European migration to North America, and a similar question as well from David.
Yeah, well, that's true, and it is being explored, and there is a little bit of DNA data that suggests a bit of European input into North American Indian populations. And as we get more samples, as they advance the DNA studies so that they can look at earlier and earlier samples, of course, that's going to be very important. But there is a trace of European DNA, but it's, in general, all the American Indian populations and the bones that have been studied from earlier time periods show Asian. So, it doesn't, the interesting thing about archaeology is it doesn't have to be a massive invasion of people. It can be just a few people with a good idea. And so you can have, earlier people, say from Asia, who came in, but all of a sudden somebody shows up with a Clovis-type projectile point and spread like wildfire because it's really efficient, or because it gets really popular. So sometimes we have trouble answering these questions of what is a diffused idea as opposed to a migrating population.
There was also a question about, and this is from Raymond, are we able to explain pre-Clovis arrowheads that are found in South America?
Well, one of the explanations is that there were pre-Clovis people there, and there probably were. There are sites that have been dated older than Clovis time period, Monteverde, for instance, and some others. But the remarkable thing is that Clovis is such a massive horizon. It's the same all over, are very similar, and it suggests the explosion of a relatively small population with a very good toolkit, a very efficient new kind of cultural adaptation that developed. So there may have been people, probably were people here, but they don't seem to have made the impact on the animals or the environments, and we don't have very many sites yet that really show conclusive evidence for, say, people 20,000, 30,000. It's not the kind of record that you get after 10 to 12,000 years ago, which is massive. So I want to now talk about what happens after the early Paleo-Indian move, after the sea levels are more or less the same as they are today. We had then a new group of people. We could call them Paleo-Asians or something like that, but they showed up around 8,000 years ago in northeastern Russia, Siberia, and they migrated into the Bering Straits, where they became the Denby culture, or known as Arctic small tool tradition. They moved down to the southern edge of Alaska, and then they spread all the way into Canada, across Arctic Canada, as these lines kind of indicate here. And that occurred around 4,000 to 4,500 years ago, at a time when the climate was very warm. And so we think that these people were, their movement, they were an Arctic adapted people in Siberia who learned how to hunt caribou and Arctic and muskox and things like that on the tundra. That this whole area had been ice-free, became ice-free around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and by 4,000 years ago, people had developed the techniques to move into that area, and they became the first early Eskimo populations of Greenland, Labrador, and central Canada. And it's they were mostly a land hunting people. They weren't sea mammal hunters like the later Eskimos we know. And so they were carrying an earlier adaptation that developed probably in Siberia and then moved in after the central Canada became ice-free. So that's a very clear indication of migration and culture change in the Arctic areas of North America. And here we just have another little scenario. Imagine yourself a Paleo-Indian in the middle of a howling winter gale when your family's off, your father's off muskox, and you're sitting in this little tent because they didn't live in underground houses. They didn't have igloos at that time. They were just little tents. And I'm just imagining, how would you deal with it as an adolescent person, a younger person, hearing a polar bear snuffling around your food cache outside your tent? I'm just suggesting here that...
Actually, before you...
Yeah.
We're starting to get some responses.
Okay.
Alan says he would pray.
Well, basically, that's a good example. That's something very good to do. That's what I was going to suggest.
Let's see if anyone else has can put themselves in the shoes of this young Paleo Eskimo. Okay, Luis is giving us an anachronistic answer. Luis will text a friend with his goodbyes, but similar to praying as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Make a lot of noise, Patricia. Play dead, says the truth in India.
You guys are very responsive, I must say. This is like a rapid turnaround.
Matt says, I would do what has worked in the past, cower or confront. Becky doesn't see a way out, but says, I'm going to die. I just better be still here. Throw out some distractions, perhaps, or maybe you have some defensive weapons nearby. Think about what my parents have told me about polar bears. Absolutely. Good.
Well, what we do find in these sites are charms, and I'm sort of suggesting here that one of the people believed that they could protect themselves by actually speaking to these animals in a spiritual sense, that their spirits could communicate. If you thought of the animal in a good way, especially if you had a charm to help protect you. People thought these things must have thought they were very important, because you find a lot of these things in the sites. So I think charms would have been something that people always had to protect themselves. Whether it worked or not, now that's not a. We don't find the remains of the charms after the polar bear got the guy. So anyway, it's you can imagine what it was like being, here's an example of a Paleo-Eskimo winter dwelling in Labrador. This is about 3,000 to 4,000 years old. There's a central passageway here, and then there's a kind of a cleared area here, which would have been a sleeping area, and another sleeping area here. Here's your ocean down here. So very Spartan kind of conditions. This is not an insulated house that would give you a lot of protection in the wintertime. And yet that's what people lived in for the first 2,000 years. That they lived in the Canadian Arctic. Then these people moved south into Labrador, and they encountered a very different culture. They encountered Indians for the first time, and we call these people maritime archaic Indians. They were the descendants of the Paleo-Indians who had learned how to hunt seals and walrus and fish and caribou, and they were moving up as the forest advanced into Labrador as the climate got warmer. And this is a killer whale effigy found in a burial site in Newfoundland. Jim Tuck and his colleagues have done some great work on these sites, and we know a lot about these early Indians. I've also excavated their sites in Labrador. As you can see, this was probably a charm. It was probably something to help protect people when they were going on the water where killer whales are around, and can cause you a lot of trouble. So here's another one. This is maybe a little out of place here. You're in a small Paleo-Eskimo hut on the Labrador coast where you found many maritime archaic Indian sites of the same time period. What might inspire a Paleo-Eskimo group to put themselves at such risk?
That's a good question. I'm curious to see what our participants would say to this one.
This is the normal kind of migration problem people face. You're moving with the weather, with your animals, with the things you know. And all of a sudden you discover that you're going into somebody else's territory. So what happens? Do they retreat? Do you fight? Do you sit down to have a powwow? Probably all those things happen. But in this case, that little tent site I showed you is a kind of emblematic of the pioneering nature of these small groups that move around the world and encounter new things. maybe they learn from it, maybe they succeed, maybe their population takes off, maybe in many cases we know they went extinct. And in some cases they just created confrontations, and the confrontation resolved the issue one way or the other.
It is amazing from a non-archaeologist point of view how you're able to try to tell the stories that are for which we only have these certain sets of clues. And I think the exercise you're doing with us here is helping us understand and appreciate the work that you do.
We have one. I mean, if I found hundreds of these sites in an area, I would say, okay, well, they're down here in massive forests. They can take care of themselves. And we'd probably find them further south, Eskimo people's moving south. But we don't. In this case, it's just a single little hut. So the guy is kind of like an isolate there, really stuck out on the edge.
Very interesting. Thank you for your comments here. An interesting one from Jose, who says, why to think only in terms of fighting? Why not cooperate? Which, of course, was one of the options that you put on the table as well. Maybe there's a way of seeking a...
Well, if how we would look at that is to see if they're cooperating, then we would expect to see some trade, maybe. We'd see maybe some Indian artifacts in the Eskimo site, or we'd see some stone that the Indians used for their artifacts all of a sudden appear in the Eskimo site as tools. Maybe as Eskimo tools, but made out of that stone. And we know that happened in several cases. We know that the maritime archaic people were using a certain kind of beautiful chert called Rama chert from northern Labrador, and they traded it far to the south. And even when there were Eskimos living in northern Labrador around those quarries, the maritime archaic people were able to access that material, either directly by voyaging in and getting it, or by trading with the Eskimos who lived there. So there were accommodations. People, there were all of those sorts of things happening.
Not to get us off too far astray here, but it might be a useful insight into how you do your work. What are some of the clues when you find certain tools where you wouldn't have expected them that suggest that they appeared there via trade versus through pillaging and conquering?
Well, for instance, you have a maritime archaic. I think if we move forward, here we go. This next slide will help us. This is a maritime archaic assemblage from the Port-au-Choix burial. And you see slate tools, these beautiful, nice bayonets, and we see harpoons here, and a spear point here. We see a beaver knife, a beaver tooth knife for cutting, carving with, and so forth. So if I saw a Paleo-Eskimo arrowhead, in the midst of this burial assemblage that we know is Indian because it's found with Indian burials and it's found further south into territories that we know are Indian, we'd say, wow, these guys are, must have met an Eskimo somewhere, or else they picked up an Eskimo tool. And the opposite would be true if we found one of these slate bayonets in an Eskimo site. So by knowing the tool forms and the context in which they found, we can relate those things to other people if we have enough information.
Thank you. That's really fascinating.
They had a wonderful burial tradition with very elegant tools. Then something big changed, and we had a cold snap, and and a new group of Eskimo people started moving south. This is called the Dorset culture. They probably descended from the earlier Paleo-Eskimo people we know as pre-Dorset, moved way south, all the way around Newfoundland and into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And this coincides with the cold period that is known as subboreal period. It starts around 500 BC. It's well known, lots of climatic records show it. So here's a very clear migration of an Arctic people down along the coast, following the Labrador Current, where seals and walrus expanded south, and moving into territories that previously had been Indian territories. And I think, oops, that's the wrong button to push. Here we go. So here's actually a picture of what one of these guys, Dorset guys, looked like. It's a little soapstone figurine that we found, and it's from the central northern Labrador coast, and you can see this wonderful, interesting parka hood that he's got. Not exactly like a modern Inuit parka hood, but sort of, would function somewhat the same way. One of our very rare images of these early Eskimo people. And these are some of the types of tools that we find, very distinctive tools. You notice they're very different from the ones we found. Now I'd like to shift, and we don't have too much time left, but I want to mention the Vikings, because the Vikings, of course, came across the North Atlantic, settled Iceland and Greenland in the warm climatic period known as the medieval warm period. And when they got to Canada, they met, these Eskimo people. Here's the Vikings, and it's the first time that peoples migrating around the world came in contact with people who migrated around the world in the other direction. So it's a major event in history, and it probably took place around 1,000 years ago. The Vikings did this because they had wonderful ships. This is from the Oslo Museum, the beautiful Gokstad and Oseberg ships. So they were able to travel the North Atlantic. Climate was warmer on their side. This is the Gulf Stream, and then here's the cold waters coming out of the Arctic. As they traveled west, they got into this colder climate. They settled Greenland, and it worked for a while. They even, Eric the Red, of course, was the first settler of Greenland. Later on, Leif Erikson, his son, went down here to Lanza Meadows, to the Vinland area. This is the region we know as Vinland. Explored all these other places as well. So they had quite a good time of it for a while. Here's the Lanza Meadows site in northern Newfoundland. Parks Canada runs it. It's a great, it's the archaeological settlement that may have been Leif's settlement, which has been very carefully excavated and described, and is the only Viking site known in the North American mainland. Here are their houses. They had 3 long houses, probably meaning 3 boats. This is from a later time period. It's a penny from the coast of Maine. It's a Viking Norwegian penny from the late 1000s, 8 decades after the Vikings disappeared from Newfoundland. So we know that they were some kind of contact between Vikings, Norsemen we call them in this part of the world, and Indians and Eskimos took place, and this was probably traded down onto the coast of Maine. Probably not evidence of a Viking settlement in that region. Walrus ivory was the one of the major export items from Greenland to supply the colonies with things they needed from Europe, and these are the famous Lewis chessmen made out of walrus ivory from Canada that were uncovered Isle of Lewis. And we find in some of those, in the Viking site at Lanza Meadows, a soapstone lamp that is of pre-Dorset or Dorset origin, indicating contact with those people. It was in the smithy, in the Norse smithy at this site. So some evidence of contact. And here's another one that I excavated in Hudson Bay. It's a copper pendant made of Norse copper, found in a Dorset Eskimo site in Hudson Bay. So they were getting around and spreading their stuff and trade, and maybe even trading for walrus ivory. Now, another thing happened in Alaska at this time. About 1,000 years ago, the Eskimo people living in Bering Strait learned how to capture whales with using big skin umiaks and very sophisticated toggling harpoons. And they were able to, using this new technology and this new source of food, they were able to travel through the Canadian Arctic Islands to migrate into Canada and Greenland. And at this time, these passages in Greenland were ice-free, and it was that warm period, and it's sort of like today. We're approaching that same condition where those ice-free channels are allowing oil tankers to go through the Canadian islands and creating a lot of other issues for people. But at that time, it allowed the Thule Eskimos to move into eastern Canada, where they met the Dorset people. This is the shot by one of the National Geographic photographers of the whale hunt, contemporary whale hunt and barrow, but this has been going on for 1,000 years. And in the eastern Arctic, this would have been one of their typical kind of villages, as seen in a National Geographic illustration. So they were a very powerful force in the eastern Arctic, much more than the Dorset culture. And this little wood carving of a Norseman was found in an Inuit house on the South Baffin shore, dating around 1350 or 14. So we know that they probably met Norsemen. They had to have made this carving and to show this kind of dress. And there's even a cross kind of like engraved on his chest here. So very interesting, unique finds sometimes. Then we began to have a problem with the weather. The Norse started having trouble in Greenland. They couldn't get boats through to Europe. Their crops, their grass, and their animals started dropping, and little ice age was on them. And very shortly, by 1500, by 1421, they disappeared from Greenland. And this is the Hvalsey Church. It's one of many churches in Greenland, Christian churches in Greenland, and this one particular one has a record of a wedding in 1421, and that's the last written word about the Vikings. No one knows, what happened to them, except that we know that their society collapsed because it had overextended its population in an area that couldn't support them when the weather turned colder and grass stopped growing as much, and they never really adapted well to the hunting life that was all around them. So there has been various explanations. One of the explanations, the classic explanation, is that the Greenland people died off from Inuit attacks as the Inuit took advantage of this cooling weather and the expanding Arctic condition, moved south into the Norse territories. Now we know that that's not true. There's no evidence of Inuit attacks and having anything to do with the disappearance of the Norse. Norse seem to have disappeared simply because they had counted on a way of life that couldn't be sustained when the temperature changed. But there are a lot of permutations of how you think about it, and there could have been, we still don't have a good explanation, as to where they actually went. Meanwhile, Eskimos, now we mostly call them Inuit people, started moving south into the Labrador region, again into areas that had been Indian at this time. This is an excavation of one of these houses, and we see images in Europe of Labrador Inuit. This is starting after 1500 when Europeans arrive. And then very soon in the 1500s, the Basques show up. And the Basques were some of the first people to use the whale resources in the greater St. Lawrence area. At this time, the Inuit were moving south and starting to raid these early Basque establishments. Here's one of the Basque whaling sites in Red Bay, an illustration from National Geographic using harpoons, very unlike the Eskimo harpoons. This is the country that they come from, Basque country. There's even an escutcheon here showing a whaling scene with a whale and whalers. The Basques were some of the first people to develop whaling in the Old World, and they came very quickly after the discovery of the New World to hunt whales in that area. I've been working on a site here. It's a Basque site, and it's quite fabulous. I'll show you just a couple of pictures. Here's the site we're working on, called Hare Harbor. This is a Basque cookhouse. Over here is a blacksmith shop. And we discovered at the end of this last summer Inuit houses over in this area, and that was quite exciting because it probably was foreshadowed by some Inuit artifacts like this soapstone lamp that we found on the Basque cookhouse floor, and also by a small fragment of a toy bow, which we don't seem to be able to go forward here for some reason.
There we go.
Oh yeah, okay. Here's some other stuff. These are beads from the Basque site. We think maybe these were actually used by Inuit people who were present at the Basque site. And we found things like this stoneware jug, olive jar, and so forth. And it looks to me like the Basques actually had employed Inuit at this time. Inuit, basically, it looks like the Inuit were moving south with this cold weather, discovered the Europeans there, and began working, initially began raiding their sites, but after 100 years began moving south and actually collaborating with them. So we actually have Inuit houses at this Basque whaling site discovered this year, which suggests that real joint cooperation with that. So we're going to wrap it up here now, and I just wanted to show you this slide. This is the modern temperature curve that we're facing today. This is what's happening today, and you've seen a lot about that. So we have a lot of questions for the future. The North is, people in the North have learned to adapt. This Sami or Lappish herder didn't have any trouble getting along fine with a snowmobile. Technology helps a lot. How the technology is going to help the polar bear is something that we're not sure, and we're waiting to see. The same with the caribou. Warming conditions are going to be hard on these Arctic animals, for sure. And it's certainly hard on the archaeology sites. This is a site in Russia that's eroding at the coast, losing tremendous amount of archaeological materials. At the same time, we're losing villages like Barrow, Alaska, Kotzebue, Deering, other places. So this is what we're faced with today. How are we going to understand these changes? How can we mitigate them? How can we slow them down if possible? And basically, how can we adapt in the future? And as I mentioned, our exhibit goes into some of these details, and I think we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next few years thinking in detail about what we can do. And the story from the Arctic helps us because it shows us that people have had great opportunities in climate change, but they've also had real serious problems with it as well. And I think that's the story of human history.
Well, it's quite a fascinating story, illustrated so well by your own work in the field and the way that you've shared it with us. So really, like a roller coaster. But we want to thank you for that. And I want to thank everyone else for participating and thinking critically about some of these scenarios. We know we went through them very quickly, but the idea was to try to put yourself in those shoes and to try to understand how people would have responded facing changes in climate and other factors that are around them. And I hope you'll continue that thinking in your own work. There was a couple of questions about some of the data with regards to temperatures and the big shifts in temperature over the past 100,000 years compared to what Scott Wing was talking about. And I think it's important to mention that Scott Wing was talking largely about global averages, and you're talking about a specific region.
We're talking about temperatures in the Arctic itself. And as some of the Camp Century core ice core readings they're taken in the area of the ice cap up there. So these are changes in the north, not necessarily global. But of course, you could see from Scott's work that the temperatures got much higher. There's no ice around the Arctic, and with those palm trees.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, and please join me in thanking Bill Fitzhugh from the National Museum of Natural History, where he is Curator of Archaeology, for a really important contribution to our online conference on climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. It was great.
We will now take a 1-hour break. We will give all of you a chance to take a break. We'll give our captioner a chance to break as well. Thank you to our captioning team at WGBH in Boston. And we will see you all in an hour with Doug Herman, who has another fascinating look at the topic. He's going to be talking about the Indian population's response and also taking us into another cultural view of climate change. So thank you very much. We'll see you in an hour.